Hello and welcome to a special edition of Talking Politics with me, Robert Peston. As I say, it is a bit special because it's a long interview that I've done with Sir Simon Case, who until just a few months ago was the most powerful civil servant in the country. He was in charge of the civil service as cabinet secretary, and he also was arguably the most important advisor to both the last Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, but also a succession of Prime Ministers in his case, because he had that job of Cabinet Secretary for both, well, for Boris Johnson, for Liz Truss, she was there for a period, and for Rishi Sunak. The reason I wanted to talk to him today is because we've had this very, very important announcement from the Prime Minister about how he's going to make us safer. We've had the publication of his Strategic Defence Review, and he's announced a whole series of investments in the armed forces, in our nuclear deterrent, in munitions factories. And I wanted to talk to Simon Case about why it's taken so long for any British government to respond to the very dangerous world we live in, particularly the threat of Putin, but equally about whether we're making the right kind of decisions in a much more general sense about how we allocate resources. This is obviously a vital question, as we're only a matter of days away from hearing from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, which departments are going to face cuts and which departments are going to get increased resources. This is his first really substantial broadcast interview since he retired. He retired because he was diagnosed with a debilitating illness, and he decided to take a step back from what is, arguably the most pressurised role in the civil service. Our conversation ranged across a whole variety of subjects that are absolutely material to all our lives. So, as I said, it is a long interview, but I think it's important, and I hope you enjoy it. So, Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. I suppose I just wanted to start with a big question, which I suspect will be puzzling to millions of British people, which is we had Putin's invasion of Ukraine more than 3 years ago. The threat that Putin poses to the security of, well, some would say the whole world, but certainly to Europe, has been plain for everybody to see for more than 3 years. So why does it take a British government more than 3 years to say we are now going to a position of war-fighting readiness, to use the Prime Minister's phrase?
I think what lies beneath a lot of this is the relative complacency that we've had, not only here in the UK, but actually across quite a lot of European nations around defence. As you said, Putin invaded, his tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border years ago, but actually what we saw was, in those months afterwards, started to be revealed some really very concerning messages about the state of European defence. Quite rightly, the UK government at the time and many others from around Europe and around the world wanted to step forward and support the Ukrainians. But of course, what we realised in that moment was the things that you need to do to support a major land war in Europe, the kit that you need, the training that you need to do, the enormous industrial infrastructure that you need to support all of these major conflicts. Actually, a lot of that had been lacking, and that's 30 years of underinvestment in defence, but also the fact that during a lot of that period, our national security had been dominated, including throughout my career, dominated by counter-terrorism. We were fighting so-called non-state actors. We were dealing with Osama bin Laden and his sort of murderous gangs. And we got there and we honed many of our capabilities, you know, the kit that we had, the training we were giving people, where we are in the world, we'd honed for that world of counter-terrorism. And actually you come along and this is a rather more old-fashioned threat to your security, which is one state invading another state. It comes along and you think, hell, we're not ready for this. And so I think, I mean, to give credit to the last Conservative government, Rishi Sunak, not long before the last election, did announce an increase in defence spending to 2.5%. This government obviously then accelerated that. Some of the issues which are in today's strategic defence review that the government are publishing are themes that have been around for the last couple of years. I think what they're really doing is, under the scrutiny of these really experienced reviewers, is sort of crystallising that. Sorry, I've long answer to a simple question. Why has it taken this long? The answer is it shouldn't have done. Government doesn't move at the pace that we would all like. But I think what we've got today is the sort of summation of these issues.
I mean, you were at the top of the civil service during this period of Putin's threat becoming crystallised. Again, something else that puzzles me is that in Trump's first term, he railed against European governments not spending enough on their own defence. He railed against our dependence on America's arms expenditure. I'm just wondering, when you were Cabinet Secretary, were there conversations in government about our dependence on America and whether this was sustainable? Because again, there is something slightly shocking, perhaps, that it has taken a second Trump term for this government to suddenly, wake up and say, actually, he's got a point. We can't rely on the Americans.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, whatever you think of Donald Trump, and he's clearly a very controversial figure, both in his domestic audience and internationally, the one thing he absolutely has done is hold up a mirror to all European nations. As you said, he told us 8 years ago now that we weren't doing enough to step forward on defence, but I think it has taken a combination. I think Putin's putting into practice the sort of things he's been threatening, his invasion of Ukraine, the growth of the real world day-to-day conflict that's going on in cyberspace involving Russians and Iranians and Chinese, whatever. This is crystallized, I think. But as I said to you before, I think there's been a sense of complacency. Which,
I mean, but when you were there, was there just a sort of sense, well, the Americans don't really mean it, they'll always have our back?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. It's certainly the case that I think first time round with Trump, there was a lot of this language around wanting to pull out of NATO and what have you. And of course, he then came to his first NATO summit. I think that would have been 2018, I think it would have been the summer of 2018, something like that. He came to his first. And he delivered some tough messages, but didn't carry through on the threat to make us stand on our own 2 feet. People did react. A good number of European nations did at that point increase their defence spending and focus on their defence. So I don't think there was the same, I think, when governments, I would suggest, across Europe saw that result of the US election in November, I think an awful lot of very serious preparation from what I could see here, but also what I was talking to about counterparts all around the world.
Yeah.
People thought, right, what's different this time is we are actually we are supporting the Ukrainians in trying to repulse Putin's attack. This is a different scenario.
And everybody knew quite the magnitude of American support, whether it was money, technology, actual armaments? I mean, American support was conspicuous.
American support is absolutely vital to NATO, and it will take other members of NATO, particularly European members of NATO, it will take a long time, even with very significant increases in spending, it will take a lot of time to replace that American military might. If the US administration does, as they're saying, switches more of its focus to the Pacific, and we across Europe as NATO members have to take more responsibility for European defence. There are those questions, many of which come up about the number of troops you've got and main battle tanks that people understand. But actually, underpinning all of that, the really vital stuff in defence is seemingly quite boring things, but vital things like logistics, training, infrastructure, and it will take us a long time to build up that infrastructure to actually replace that burden that the Americans have been carrying for us.
I mean, you were around at the time. I mean, I remember being, I suppose, slightly shocked that with our long-range missiles and with France's long-range missiles, as I understood it, in both cases, we couldn't authorise Zelensky and Kyiv to deploy those missiles into Russian territory because the guidance system was American-owned and Biden was not prepared to authorise for quite a long time. And therefore it wasn't just that we might not have had enough of the basic armaments, but we didn't have the technology.
It isn't right that the guidance system was theirs.
So it's not the GP. It's not the access to GPS.
No.
So tell me what the issue is.
That is all sovereign.
Yeah.
The issue with the Americans was actually the sort of integrated intelligence targeting support. So it was.
So that's not So the targeting support is not the same as GPS. It's something slightly different.
No. So as it were, the Americans, you can fire your missiles independently, and they can go where you want. Yeah. But the nature of where you're firing them is in Ukraine was, and I believe still is, sort of a very integrated international effort. So you've got American information and intelligence telling you what you want to target, and it's that.
I see. So it's dependence on their intelligence capability rather than the sort of, in a sense, the locational technology.
Yeah, and the fact that as is the.
But it's still a tremendous dependence.
Oh no, I mean, so sorry. The point is the right one. It's just the technicalities a bit different. All of our national security capabilities, or the vast majority of them, we have been developing over the decades for quite understandable reasons. Yeah. We developed them all with an alliance-based mentality behind this.
America, the so-called Five Eyes.
Five Eyes, particularly in the case of intelligence.
Yeah. And that's America, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and us.
And us, that's right, which long-standing goes all the way back to the Second World War. Yeah. That is the underpinning of our intelligence relationships in the world, and our intelligence agencies are incredibly integrated. And the same is also true on the defence side, the sort of the war-fighting bits that, I mean, at the moment, we're flying F-35 jets, which are designed and built by an American company, but they're flown by lots of European NATO allies. Bits of them are actually built here in the United Kingdom.
This is a Lockheed jet, isn't it?
It's a Lockheed Martin jet. But bits of that F-35 are built up in a BAE Systems factory up in the northwest of the country. And the way that, because, I mean, it is re-emphasised today in the Strategic Defence Review, a NATO-first doctrine. All of our capabilities are thought through that the UK is very unlikely to be doing this alone. You'll be doing everything in a coalition, and it's always been our assumption.
And speaking of that assumption, that's a perfectly reasonable assumption, is it?
Yeah, it's been the assumption of the collective Western defence actually since the foundations of NATO. There are one or two things that you do in a sovereign way, but actually many defence reviews. George Robertson has just been instrumental in writing this defence review, NATO First. Actually, if you go back and read his
original one,
his 1998 defence review, and it imagines the type of wars that we would be fighting as the United Kingdom. It starts from the assumption that you will be fighting wars in coalitions with your alliances.
Just like now.
And just like now, and with the Americans at the heart of them. So, and it's certainly not, it's certainly not irrational for a nation to want to make the most of its own defence by, instead of doing everything yourself, you work in alliances. That makes sense when you're a nation of 60 to 70 million people. You've got an economy the scale that you have, you've got an armed forces at the scale. That you would want to magnify the impact of both your defences and your ability to fight wars overseas by working in others. So that's really what's been at the, that's really what's at the heart of this. And
but so, of course, whether it's economies of scale or whether it's just making sure that, a bit like trade, areas of our competitive advantage are married to the Americans' areas of competitive advantage, and we're all better off, right? That all makes sense. But what we have seen since the inauguration of Donald Trump is, because American resources, in all senses, whether it's money or technology, so overwhelm any individual European nation's resources, it means that when it comes to possible moves towards ending the Ukraine conflict, Europe at the moment very much looks like a continent with a subsidiary role, and that everything is really being bossed out of Washington. And that feels, I think, to many people as uncomfortable, given that this is a European war. It is not an Atlantic war, or a Pacific war for that matter.
I could not agree more. This is a deeply uncomfortable moment in our times. As I said, for me, across Europe, I do think we've been complacent. We have been very comfortable sheltering under Uncle Sam's umbrella, and we've relied on it. And as you say, here comes a moment, a particular moment in history where you have a European land war and a US president who says, actually, I think you lot need to stand on your own 2 feet more. It is an incredibly uncomfortable moment for us. And actually, we should, I think we should give this government some credit for its reaction to that. I think Keir Starmer has genuinely acknowledged the importance of the moment for the UK to step forward, and I think he has been at the forefront of arguing for the so-called coalition of the willing to support the Ukrainians, although has made clear it still needs an American backstop to it, because that's still the military reality of the world. Anything without an American backstop at the moment is undeliverable. So I think this government, I can't quite remember when Keir Starmer went to Parliament to announce the 2.5 and then the ambition to get through. I think it was back in January or February. So it was pretty quickly after or even before President Trump had come in. So, they have reacted. But fundamentally, it is uncomfortable. And what really now underlies all this, which we will see play out in the coming weeks, because, of course, today is a big moment. You've got the Strategic Defence Review being published by the Ministry of Defence and Government. In about 10 days' time, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will be on her feet in Parliament talking about the spending review, the mechanism by which the government sets out the next 3 years of budgets, department by department and issue by issue. And this choice, many would argue it's not a choice, it's a blunt reality you have to face of spending more money on defence. Well, you spend more money on defence, that means you can't spend that same money elsewhere. And so in 10 days' time, I think we'll start to see the consequences, these really difficult choices that any government and all governments around Europe are having to make decisions. If you want to spend more money on defence, it means we're going to be spending less money on something else because none of us can afford to borrow anymore. I mean, you understand that much better than most, given your economics background. We've maxed out, all European nations have pretty much maxed out their credit cards. So these are the choices that governments are going to have to make. And of course, that's the thing, the sort of the political reality that actually slightly tells you the story of why is it that European nations have been comfortable sheltering under the American umbrella. It is, well, because...
Yeah, we got a free ride because they didn't want to cut welfare and they didn't want to cut...
Exactly. And this is why, President Trump has really held up a mirror to us as being incredibly uncomfortable for us, because it shows us the nature of that choice that we've been making.
Now, I want to talk about the spending implications, but there's a couple of other things I just wanted to check, sort of talk through with you, really. One is, Keir Starmer used this phrase that he's putting the UK, I think he said, in a state of war preparation readiness.
War readiness, I think, is the language the government is using.
What did you understand by that?
Yeah.
Was this a phrase you'd come across?
I mean, war fighting readiness is one of those perhaps slightly classically defence, national security sort of phrases which is around, which most people think, what on earth does that mean? I think the government is using it to try and convey the sense that this isn't now a far-off prospect. We are supporting the Ukrainians in a European land war right now. It is our munitions which the United Kingdom was holding in reserve for war. We have, over the last couple of years, been releasing those munitions to give to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. So I think this is what the government is trying to convey. Sorry, am I waving? No, sorry.
No. Okay.
The government is trying to convey this sense of it being a here and now issue. Certainly over many years, the battle in cyberspace is one that has been being fiercely fought between actually the Five Eyes that we talked about, our intelligence alliance, and attackers from countries that would do us harm. So
North Korea, Iran, Russia, China.
Yeah, these are the big cyber powers that the sort of are trying to have been trying to sort of do us harm. This battle for control over international organisations is something that's actually been going on for a long time. So many of the vital United Nations bodies, the international organisations, which most people have never heard of, but they're absolutely vital in setting standards in electronics and the information space. These are potentially very nerdy topics, but these are the things that actually set the rules for how your mobile phone works, how your internet works, and all these sorts of things. There have been battles for control of those bodies going on for years.
Because there are national security implications?
Absolutely. Control of things like the spectrum and the rules that dictate how phones work and how international communications work are mostly day-to-day incredibly useful for us as consumers with our phones in our pocket. But those things also have national security aspects to them as well.
What, because there is potential for a rogue state to get into our infrastructure by the back door if the rules aren't written properly?
Correct. So, I mean, you could be a nation that wants to make it, you would want to lower the standards that makes it exactly easier for, as you've described, it makes it easier for them to, again, sorry to use the language, but to position on your infrastructure. That means, hack your system and sit there so that when they want to, they can start playing around.
So there's vigilance even on these international bodies that are essentially just there to set sort of fairly basic infrastructure standards.
Yeah, and if you look back over recent years, this growing battle of control between states, that reversion back to countries being in conflict as opposed to countries taking on terrorist entities, which dominated so much of the last couple of decades, that has been written through a whole series and talked about by a series of governments, and trying to galvanise international responses to that. There's been a lot of talk amongst G7 nations over, well, perhaps I'm thinking about the last 10 years here. I remember when I was going to G7 meetings back actually during President Trump's first term, real concerns being raised about China's so-called Belt and Road Initiative. This was China seeking to use its economic might to start taking control of strategically important infrastructure and resources all around the world.
Absolutely. In South America, in Africa.
Africa in particular, the competition for the resources, again, rare earth metals, most people have never heard of the names, but your iPhone or other phones are available. These things wouldn't work without these metals.
And they control a vast proportion of the world's supplies.
Absolutely, and strategically important moments. China starting to open its own overseas military bases, sort of thing that we, of course, have got used to after the Second World War, with the Americans doing that. China is now doing that. I think actually in one of the places is Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, where you've actually got both China and the United States both operating military bases out of the same place. Actually, China, to pick on them again, there is, people perhaps will have noticed over the last few years, every so often you hear about China taking control of some obscure new atoll in the Pacific and building some runway for their military aircraft to use. This has been going on for a long time.
So you presumably were not therefore surprised when the US Defense Secretary just the other day, Pete Hegseth, says, this sounds rather glib, and I don't mean it to sound glib, but when I talk to my sort of intelligence contacts here and, around the world in America, the working assumption appeared to be there would be no invasion of Taiwan by China till 2027. Pete Hegseth, I think, when I listened to what he had to say the other day, he rather implied it could be earlier than that.
Yeah, I confess I didn't understand the language. I didn't understand precisely what he meant by imminent. Certainly, inside the UK government, and certainly now I'm no longer in government, I certainly say to people, we spend an awful lot of our money as a nation, as do our allies, on secret intelligence to help us understand the secrets of other nations, of our adversaries. One of the things we've not been great at is reading the speeches of autocrats and dictators. So President Xi has told his military and his economy to get ready for, as he would put it, the reunification, to the rest of us, the invasion of Taiwan in 2027, 2028. That his forces have to be ready to do that, and his economy is able to withstand the sanctions that he assumed would come on China for doing that. Exactly. So it's there in plain text, or translated for most people if you don't read Mandarin, but this is there. So, and perhaps that's the thing, when you get prime ministers and others using the language about war fighting capability and readiness, these things aren't a million miles into the future. Here we have the leader of the Chinese Communist Party setting out his timetable in public. So we probably better be ready for it.
Now, one issue that is absolutely central to this whole issue of war-fighting readiness, to use the Prime Minister's phrase, he says he's now putting us in a position, saying we're going to be in that position now, is the condition of our nuclear capability. There's a number of things I want to ask you about that, but I want to start with some public statements that somebody you worked with, Dominic Cummings. He was Boris Johnson's chief of staff. You were in 10 Downing Street together. He very publicly, about a year ago, said, our nuclear capability is in a shockingly poor state. It is not fit for purpose. Was he right?
I haven't seen precisely what Dom said, but I sort of know the spirit of it from that, and I don't quite know where Dom will have been getting his information from, so I sort of can't comment on the sort of specifics of what is it.
But you were cabinet secretary. How anxious were you that it was not in great shape?
So I mean, like much of our defence infrastructure over recent decades, not enough attention had been paid to our nuclear enterprise, and this was recognised by the government actually a few years ago. So started to significantly increase the investment in our nuclear infrastructure, which is all around the country, to respond to that. And I think it,
and it's everything from the warhead through the delivery mechanisms.
So in broad handfuls, you have our nuclear weapons factory, which is Aldermaston down in the south east, which is where the warheads are built. You have Barrow up in Cumbria, which is where we build our nuclear submarines. They are stationed up in Scotland in Faslane, and then down in Devonport, down in Plymouth is where much of the maintenance takes place. And then there are lots and lots of companies all around the United Kingdom that sort of contribute to that. And as I said, like a good chunk of the rest of our sort of defence infrastructure, not enough money had been spent on some of the really boring things, the buildings, the cranes, the things, this is big, serious engineering.
No, I mean, I remember talking to somebody who'd been in Aldermaston, and they said he couldn't believe the poor condition of some of the buildings.
Well, I mean, it won't be true for much longer, but at Aldermaston, it was a Second World War airfield for fans of Band of Brothers, the I think Tom Hanks series that our own Damien Lewis played in. His 101st Airborne units, actually in real life, they took off from Aldermaston on D-Day. That is one of the places that the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, took over from. And some of the buildings at Aldermaston had been built during the Second War, and they're still there.
Still being used.
And some of our scientists who were doing some of the most amazingly difficult sort of physics calculations and thinking about some of the most highly complex engineering, they were housed in these buildings. Now, that's being completely modernised. There's a whole new team in there that's changing it. The government has put in the money and bringing in the expertise to do it. But that's just one example. I mean, one of the areas I know very well, because I do some work up there, is in Barrow in Cumbria, which is where we build our nuclear submarines. Here's a really good example of trying to explain, hopefully a bit better to the public, about the problem with the peaks and troughs of defence. Yeah. So we all, for very good reason, celebrate the end of the Cold War. You don't need to spend anywhere near so much of your national resource on defence. So that's what happens through the 1990s and the early 2000s. And as a consequence of decisions taken in that period, we stopped building nuclear submarines. These are enormous and highly complex things. The engineers that I've spoken to, both there and at NASA tell me these things are more complicated to build than space shuttles.
Really?
They are some of the most complex machines built on Earth.
Because if they fail, the consequences.
I mean, like space, underwater is they call it a highly hostile environment, incredibly difficult, and these things need to be silent. They need sophisticated defence mechanisms. Obviously, some of our submarines are designed to fire missiles. So highly complicated things. So, but we stopped building them. Yeah. And when you stop doing things like this, and your workforce is laid off, and those skills they atrophy, and for about 10, 15 years. We stopped building these things. So it's unsurprising when you decide you've got to start again, it becomes incredibly time-consuming and expensive to learn all over again how to build these things.
But it is depressing that it's one of the things that has worried me most about the last 15 or so years is we got so. I mean, this is not just about not preserving our nuclear know-how, but we just weren't preparing for, use a slightly tedious technical phrase, for what we call high impact, low probability events. And the reason I got increasingly frustrated about this is, the financial crisis was a low probability, massively high impact event that did us enormous economic harm. COVID was another one. Yeah. And then you just think, particularly after you've been through two, at that point, the whole of government would have been energised to realise, actually, if there's a potential but catastrophic event, we'd better, and I know you do these annual risk assessments, but I just didn't get the feeling there was enough urgency behind protecting us, whether it's the nuclear threat or indeed other threats.
I'm absolutely right. I'd be with you, one of those people who was, jumping up and down saying we need to pay a lot more attention to these low probability, high impact risks, because actually for career experiences and pre-joining government, this world of national security, thinking about the Cold War, this was my background and very much sort of how I grew up thinking about the world. But what we shouldn't lose sight of is that making the choices to make your economy more resilient, to make your health service more resilient, to spend more money on your defence, that means that taxpayers' money cannot be spent elsewhere.
But then you've got to have a conversation with British people, about, in the end, you're going to have less of this because otherwise you could be dead.
So look, this is exactly the point that I want to make that you've just made is there's a what politicians say to us as voters, but also what we as voters are demanding of our politicians, which is, if a politician comes along and tells you you can have all of everything, you should probably be a little sceptical about that, because I don't think Nigel Lawson first used the to govern is to choose phrase, but he used it, and I think he then went on to say something like, "In the absence of the ability to choose is the absence of the ability to govern." That is the reality of governing. I've spent particularly the last 10 years of my career working closely with politicians, and of course people who put themselves forward in politics, they put themselves up for scrutiny. Actually the reality of governing is having to take a series of really very difficult decisions. So But that's really, that's what's happening today. This government wants to spend more money on defence. As I said, in 10 days' time, let's have a look at the Chancellor's numbers in the spending review to see they've obviously already said they've taken a choice which I think is difficult for them politically, on spending less money on development. That actually probably is popular in the country, but I suspect within the Labour Party was a distinctly more controversial thing.
For a Labour government,
cutting benefit, cutting
to 0.3% what we spend as a share of GDP on overseas aid was a controversial thing for them to do.
And it's a government that wants to cut benefits, and that's to free up money elsewhere. So it is a government that looks to me like it actually wants to, sort of does understand its duty to take decisions. So deserve credit for that, whatever else people might think of them.
And can I ask, there's one other thing about nuclear, and then I just want to talk a little bit about a broader question, which gets back to your issue about resources. So one of the things I hadn't appreciated until I happened to be having a conversation with a very major French defence contractor is that France has submarines, but it can also deliver, terrible word, deliver.
Yes.
Deliver nuclear weapons from the air.
From jets.
It has two delivery mechanisms. It has submarines and jets. And we only have submarines. And I was slightly shocked, actually, to discover that to that extent they appeared to have, some might say, a more robust nuclear defence infrastructure. And indeed, I then looked it up, and I think they've actually got more nuclear warheads than we have. So how did that happen? How did we fall behind the French in that sense? And it appears to be the case, but the government won't confirm it, but they're also not denying it, that they are in talks with the Americans about acquiring an air delivery mechanism. So two things really, how did we fall behind? But secondly, are they right that we do need an air delivery mechanism?
Yeah. We had both air and sea delivery mechanisms, you say, submarine-launched missiles and air-dropped bombs until the late 1990s. Yeah. So at the end of the Cold War is when we took out, actually I think it was 1998. Apologies if I've got the year slightly wrong, something like that. Yeah. We took out of service the last of our air-dropped nuclear weapons. And it was very interesting. I was having a discussion with one of the senior defence figures who was around at the time, not a politician, but on the sort of military official side, and said to me, one of the biggest regrets they'd got about their time was not arguing at that point for us to replace our air-dropped weapon with another one. They do different things, and a submarine-launched capability is probably the most protected resilience. It is still relatively easy to hide a nuclear submarine in an ocean. I mean, when you see how big they are, that is quite difficult to imagine, but the ocean's a very big place and they're very quiet, and the crews are incredibly skilled, and one of the reasons they're so expensive is they're designed to be very quiet. Even, it's not just the engines, but, the kitchens, the showers, everything has to be made extremely quiet so your adversaries can't hear you. So, if you're going to have one system, it is definitely right.
That's the preference.
Yes, I think there's some absolutely, classically hilarious and typically well-informed Yes, Prime Minister episode about this, where the chief scientist is sort of telling the Prime Minister it was all about Trident at the time, because that was the big debate in the Thatcher era about upgrading to Trident. And the MOD chief scientist says, "But Prime Minister, this is the Rolls-Royce of nuclear weapons." But look, most people, I think, will recognise that in daily life, with especially something that's like a critical system, it's good to have some degree of resilience and some degree of flexibility. And so having, like the French do, a couple of different ways of delivering your deterrence is probably sensible if you can afford it. I mean, you've got to be careful.
Afford it? They are not a richer economy than us. Let's be absolutely clear.
It depends. I mean, it depends precisely how you choose to do it, but you probably can afford it. And I think, as we head towards, well, first of all, let's see what
Did you make it when you were there? Did you make a recommendation that we should do this?
So obviously, I'm not going to go with you into, it's one of the things, I'm very happy to talk to you about generalities, but, one of the things I have to do, as far as I can, out of fairness to the people I used to work with and the people still there, is start doing the details of what advice I didn't, because it's not fair.
It's not a bad idea.
Flexibility and resilience are a good idea in most things, especially in defence.
Especially when, you talked about how we didn't build any new nuclear submarines for years, and, many people would say it's a good thing that we are now, and we've got this deal with Australia and America, the so-called AUKUS deal, where there'll be even more than there would have been otherwise nuclear submarines built. Not all of them will be enabled to fire nuclear weapons. But one of the things that I did find genuinely shocking recently was because our nuclear submarines are so old, they have, I think a couple of them were out of service for a bit. And there was, I think one of the nuclear submarines was at sea for some inordinately long time. Months and months and months. And I was just trying to think what it would be like to be a submariner stuck away from your family, away from home, right at the bottom of the ocean for all those months. You'd go mad, wouldn't you?
Submariners are an extraordinary breed of people. A bit like you. You've been around reporting on government and politics for a very long time, but, you say that even with all of that experience, you didn't necessarily understand it all. As the Prime Minister said earlier today in his speech, these crews are at sea for 6 months.
Well, sometimes, as I say, recently longer than that, which was the issue.
It's about 6 months. Anyway, between 3-6 plus months. They are extraordinarily dedicated people. They can't communicate with their families during that time. So it puts not only huge pressure on them, they're highly skilled and they do obviously huge amounts of training, but the pressure that it puts on their families as well. One of the most extraordinary experiences, I've had the chance to do it a few times, including when we take prime ministers to do it, is when one of these submarines come back from what we call on patrol, so when it's been out somewhere hiding, ready to launch nuclear weapons if that's what the government of the day should order it to do. They come back off patrol, and I don't know whether they welcome it or not, but obviously they kind of pop the hatch, and then usually a VIP is welcomed on board to come and listen to them about how it's gone and hear the experiences. And actually, Keir Starmer did that pretty quickly as Prime Minister. Yeah. He's talked about that. Yeah. One of the things, so that bit I think is relatively well known. The thing that's even more extraordinary, though, is before they welcome the VIP on board, the first thing that the commanding officer of the submarine has to do is they come up and they will receive a lot of messages because it's now safe for them to do. And in those messages will be births, marriages and death notices.
I can't imagine what it's like.
So the commanding officer will have to sit crew members down who've been incommunicado for that whole patrol and say, I'm very sorry, X or Y is seriously ill, somebody may have died, congratulations, it's a boy, congratulations, it's a girl, and then they obviously get them straight off the boat and get them home to their family. The dedication of that submarine community is extraordinary. And of course, being submariners, like submariners have been throughout the ages, they don't shout about what they do. Their endurance that their families, have to have to have is just extraordinary. They are remarkable human beings.
No question. And as I say, which is why I got, about a year, it was about 6 to 9 months ago, I got genuinely upset on their behalf to understand that because we hadn't invested enough in the submarines and they were somewhere out of service, that a particular tour of duty was significantly more months than the 6, which is supposed to be the maximum. Which
absolutely, it's absolutely right. Your fundamental point is the failure. Nuclear submarines are an extreme example of what happens in defence, where if you as a government choose not to take a decision at the right time, the consequences of that decision come for your successor's successor's successor. Yeah. So these incredibly long patrols. So one of the jobs that I did in government, actually 20 odd years ago, was working in the Ministry of Defence on our nuclear programme. I came into government to do that. Did the work back that culminated in 2006. I don't know whether you remember, but Tony Blair stood up in Parliament and announced that we were going to buy a successor class of submarines, so our nuclear submarines, the Dreadnought class that's now being built at Barrow. He announced that in 2006. And actually...
And it's now 2025.
It's now 2025. These boats will come into service in the early 2030s. That's the amount of time it takes. Now, actually, the decision to get on with that production of that new class was delayed during the coalition era. People may not remember that the Liberal Democrats in government, as is their right, they expressed concerns about this, so the programme wasn't going as fast-paced as it could have done because it was paused inside the MOD. Money was diverted onto other priorities and not nuclear. And our submariners today and their families are suffering because of the failure to execute effectively decisions back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, which is, as you say, again, it gets back to this point that, you've got to plan for the long term. We don't do enough of that in this country. And you've got to be honest with British people about the choices, the trade-offs. Yeah. Which takes me, I suppose, to the sort of final area I want to talk about, which is, I think arguably the government has got itself into a bit of a mess over its commitment to increase resources. So, you're right that Keir Starmer did this, many people say quite sensible thing, to preempt the inevitable criticism from Donald Trump by increasing the share of our national income that we devote to defence from 2.3% to 2.5%. He did that by cutting what we spend on overseas aid. And he did that around the time, I can't remember precisely whether it was immediately before or immediately after, like you, can't remember, but it was around the time of his inauguration. Right, so he could say to the American president when he went to see him, look, we're doing what you asked us to do. But there is a consensus across the defence community that we need to spend more. And the consensus isn't just in this country. And if you look at what the NATO Secretary General has said, he says that NATO members should commit to spend 3.5% on hard military stuff, equipment and armies, and then another 1.5% on sort of softer protection. So he's really talking about 5% of national income being spent on our security. The Prime Minister has said, since our spending went up to 2.5%, that in the next Parliament he would like to get the spending up to 3%, not the 3.5% that the NATO Secretary General says, but 3%, which is, I think from memory, something like another 16 billion or so per annum on 16 billion pounds per annum, something like that, on defence. But he has said it's an ambition and it is subject to us not breaking these blessed fiscal rules which talk about the debt coming down in 5 years' time. Yeah. And so today he's felt a barrage of questions from sort of journalists and criticism from opposition MPs that he's not really committing enough to our defence, right? Given that he does want to be seen to be prudent with the nation's money, what could he or should he have said differently so that he wouldn't face the charge that this is just words?
This is the stuff that, This is the sort of stuff that dominates your life when you're in government, and I confess I have sat around thinking, this morning as I saw, the last couple of days as this has come along, I think, I wonder what I would have said about this, and then mostly concluded, I'm very grateful that I'm not having to give this advice anymore. You know this very well, and I think most people will understand it. The nation's finances, through a whole series of events, have got themselves into a right old mess. You talked earlier on about the global financial crash. I think as we went in that 2007-2008 period into the global financial crash, our debt to GDP ratio was something like high 30s, 40% debt to GDP.
Certainly in 2000, 2001, it was down to literally 30%. It rose gradually to something like 40%. Yeah. But and we're now 100%.
We've been 100%. So to bail out banks and to bail out, genuinely, it wasn't just about bailing out banks, it was bailing out people with bank accounts. Gordon Brown put a lot on the nation's credit card and it went up. And then COVID and put huge amounts of more debt in, and Ukraine, making sure that everybody could have huge amounts of money off their energy bill to protect them from the shock after Ukraine energy bill. We spent this. So
these are enormous sums of money.
These are absolutely huge sums of money. Now, normally you'd say, okay, nation's credit card is maxed out. So what's the alternative that you've got? Well, at home, what you try and do is you try and get a salary raise. So that's the equivalent of the country needing better growth. And our growth as a nation has been utterly anemic during this same period. So chancellors haven't been able to spend their way out of this. But what's really interesting is spending in public services, growth in spending in public services has massively outstripped GDP growth, which is why we're now paying so much in tax for what feels like relatively, in many cases, some cases fantastic public services, but for a lot of people feels like mediocre public services, because we've got ourselves, the lines on our graph a nightmare. So we should have some sympathy for the Chancellor and her team, and indeed previous chancellors. They've got to make these sums add up, because as you see, we have now seen as a nation, if you go out with reckless spending commitments.
Sure. But here's the thing. All right. So
and just to finish on this, people say, what's this bond market's nonsense? That is really important too. Every time the price of our debt goes up, that is more day-to-day government spending that's being spent on servicing our debt than is being spent on schools and hospitals and nuclear submarines.
No, and of course, everybody would accept that we would rather have a much lower interest bill in terms of the government, what the government pays out in interest. Of course, everybody would accept the government should pay out less in interest and more for schools and hospitals. Of course, we all think that. I guess the interesting question for me is whether governments, whether it's the Sunak government or indeed the current government, slightly misunderstood the Truss Kwarteng debacle. Because there's no question in any of our minds that was, quite close to being a catastrophe. In fact, before I develop this point, interestingly, I did a long interview with Liz Truss as part of a separate podcast series, and actually, I said to her, why did you reverse, get rid of quasi-quartering, reverse the mini budget, the one that had so upset investors, led to the price of British government bonds falling, and therefore the interest rate that the government pays rise so much. I said, why did you, replace quartering with Jeremy Hunt, abandon many of the tax cuts that you'd promised in the mini budget? And she said, it was because you, Simon Case, had written her a letter in which you'd said that the Bank of England's emergency support for the bond market was coming to an end, and there was a risk that at the end of the Bank of England's support, if these measures that the markets, bond investors didn't like were still in place, that the government might struggle to borrow, which is, of course, about the worst crisis that any government can go through.
It wasn't just that, by the way.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have just been a challenge on the government's ability to borrow. It would have been that many companies that we don't think about, but we do rely on day in, day out, like insurance companies, would suddenly find themselves in very serious financial trouble.
Yeah, because the value of their assets would have...
The value of their assets were falling very fast. So it was, I'm interested to know that the former Prime Minister is freely talking about advice given. Of course, in that scenario, someone like me, spend a lot of time actually at the then Prime Minister's request, speaking to all of the experts that you can find, both domestically and internationally, to say what is the right thing to do here. The history of this, we've had version 1 of the history of this. Version 2 and 3 and 4, I'm sure, will come. I think one of the most interesting things that gets forgotten about that period was there was an initial reaction to the mini budget, but actually the thing that really spooked the markets was outside Parliament, in the context of the Conservative Party conference a few days later, the then senior ministers were making comments about going further and faster. And it was actually at that moment, it was about those suddenly going much further than anyone had anticipated that I think really made people think, what is happening here? Something happened that markets really didn't expect.
Oh no! It was a genuine crisis. I lived and breathed it, and this is a conversation for another time.
But what's your thing about misreading it? I've never heard this. What's your thing about how they might have misread it? I'm really interested in it.
Okay. So I'll let's move on to that. My view is this. Okay. And I think you would probably agree with this, but I don't think it's a distinction that ministers have enough in their minds, right? Which is, it is certainly the case, and I think Donald Trump is finding this now, that lenders to any government, worry about the sustainability of the debt burden you've got, and worry if there's a big chunk of money that either has to be borrowed in the short term or refinanced in the short term. This stuff matters, right? But I also take the view that if you spell out compelling plans for investments that either keep you safe, the kind of thing we've been talking about today, or can demonstrably increase the productivity and growth rate of your economy, then actually investors will lend you the money, because they're not so stupid that they can't make the distinction between funding for essentially lifestyles and funding that actually makes a country richer. And I think the thing that has worried me post the mini budget and that crisis is that the Treasury and indeed ministers have rather lumped together all spending and borrowing, because frankly, from the point of view of your ability to borrow, there is good spending and borrowing, essentially investment, you put into the good category if it's proper investment, and then there is lifestyle stuff. And if you go mad on lifestyle stuff, investors panic and they say you're borrowing too much. But if they see you doing sensible things, like for example, I think you could argue that quite a lot of what the Prime Minister's announced today in terms of munitions manufacturing, investment in nuclear technology, these are going to create jobs.
These are sound investments.
I think many people would say these are sensible investments, particularly if we get spin-offs of a technological sort that create new enterprises and new products to sell. Yeah. Right?
I completely agree with you. I think this is a I mean, I'm not an owner of government debt, so I don't get to decide. And it's the people who hold our debt get to decide this. But I think you are absolutely right that there is a differentiation between what I suspect the people who buy our bonds are pretty clever people, and they will differentiate.
But I think they differentiate in a way more than the current crop of ministers understand.
The only thing I'd say, just in defence of Rachel Reeves, is actually last autumn, in setting out her adjusted fiscal rules, she did actually go some way towards acknowledging this point by giving herself more breathing space.
Sure, the debt measure now nets off investments, which is
on the capital side. Sure. And so I think that is something, and I think that shift increased the amount of government spending. It was like best part of £200 billion, I think, additional capital. So I think that has been recognised. I think the problem, though, is it's really on the growth side. So I think, all right, people who own our debt, happy, good strong investments in defence, in infrastructure, your power stations, your roads, your rails, all good. This is the stuff that makes the country more effective. Yeah. One of the things
But again, look, as I say, I think the way that she changed her fiscal rules were definitely a step in the right direction in terms of creating more space for her to borrow to invest. Quite a lot of that investment, though, to be absolutely clear, will not increase the growth rate of the UK.
This is the thing I think that the people who hold our debt, the bond markets, are still yet to be convinced about by any British government for a very long time,
that is the point
is that we have got a credible growth plan. So now I'm not in government, I do get the chance to speak much more to sort of some of these people, some of these institutions. And you ask them, so what is it about the UK that we're not doing that you like? And they do look at these things and they say, it's great you want to spend money, but what on earth is going on with your planning regulations? You say you want to build all these houses and young people can't afford them. You say you want to build all of these power stations, you want to build roads and rails, but we look at it and nothing ever gets done because your planning system means, everything is slow and everybody gets to block it, and now infamously bats get £200 million tunnels or whatever it was that HS2. So I think the thing that people want to see more from the government, sort of the international finance markets, what they want to see more is really credible plans that will inject growth into the country, and that's the thing that they're sceptical about.
And just because we ought to wrap up in a minute, do you think, and I don't think this would be an unreasonable position to take, that it's not a bad play for a government that doesn't yet really have what most people would describe as a compelling growth strategy? It says the right things about planning reform. It's got a whole bunch of, we are going to get at some point, maybe not too long off, who knows, its growth plan. It's got a whole bunch of working groups trying to come up with ideas. We've got Germany borrowing, way more than it has done in recent history to invest in infrastructure and defence. Yeah. We've got the European Union as a whole also looking at regulations which have been dampening on growth. Keir Starmer talks about what he's announced today as essentially the basis of a defence industrial strategy that will contribute to the growth rate of the UK. I guess my question is, when you then see in the round everything, is he yet ambitious enough?
I think the thing that needs to be done to make true the Prime Minister's words of today, but perhaps even more so, he gave a speech a few weeks back at a defence conference in which he talked about national security being the central organising principle of government, which people like me with a national security background really welcome. For that to be true, it has to be equally the case that your Treasury, your Transport Department, your Education Department delivering skills, your Health Department that's building hospitals, your Housing Department that's, your Environmental and your Energy, they have to see delivering defence-focused growth and national security as core to their tasks as the Ministry of Defence and your intelligence agencies don't.
And how do you persuade them to do that?
Well, there's the carrot and the stick. Usually in government, the Prime Minister saying this is the priority often works. Then there are all sorts of hard levers that you have to do. In the end, there are some brutal controls that the Treasury has over government spending, which, as you say, look, if you build schools here which are focusing on STEM subjects because we need them to build our new aeroplanes, or we need them to build our new submarines, you can start attaching all sorts of conditions to your spending. Or you can say, well, actually, ONHS, you will get more money, but we're going to put some really tough restrictions on you that say if you don't deliver X amount of productivity improvements, we're not releasing the next year's money. There are some ways of doing it. We did mobilise. During the Cold War, and we should be careful about some of these parallels to the Cold War, but it does tell you what can be done. During the Cold War, it was pretty obvious to most people in government that national security and supporting the nation's defence was an overridingly important task in government. And it was everybody's job to be part of delivering safe, secure nation.
Should we be back in that mindset, in your view? Is the risk, because I don't think we are, I don't think government is, and I definitely don't think the nation is back in that mindset. Should we be back in that mindset?
I think that is what the Prime Minister is saying today about, that's for me, when I hear Prime Minister talking about something like, readiness for war and that sort of thing. For me, that is the language of mobilising the whole of the government effort behind national security and then the whole of the nation's effort. I think you're right, though. This is a very big change that is happening in our society, the way we live our lives. People might ask, quite legitimately say, what on earth has China invading Taiwan got to do with my life when my family's working 2 jobs, we're struggling to make ends meet? Well, the consequences for global trade of China invading Taiwan will make what happened during COVID and Ukraine, relatively speaking, pale into comparison.
I agree. Chinese manufacturing is integral to our entire
everything.
way of life.
Taiwan, absolutely critical for superconductors and all these sorts of things. Absolutely essential. So, and I think this, it's really interesting that there's language in the Strategic Defence Review today, which the reviewers have put in, which is about a whole of society, whole of nation approach. And quite rightly, people say, well, what does that mean? And I think, I hope the government will be bolder in the sort of weeks and months to come in telling the people of the country, this is the world that we now live in, I'm afraid.
And if you want you and your children to be safe, we've got to spend money on it, and there is going to be less of other stuff.
There is going to be less of other stuff. At the same time, you said it before, there are opportunities. One of the great things which I welcome about the Strategic Defence Review, which I passionately believe in, is we've got to make this additional money drop into the pockets of British workers. There are some amazing British businesses doing all sorts of innovation, as well as doing some good old-fashioned engineering, who should stand to gain from that, and that will be... These are great, high-quality, high-wage jobs. These are the sorts of jobs that I want my children to be doing. It's one of the reasons I do a lot of my work now in places like Barrow, because I'm trying to make sure that all over the country we are creating amazing opportunities for young people, give them the skills that they need through education, and then get them these great jobs that lead to them leading good lives and also supporting the nation's defence.
I mean, we probably do need to wrap up, and it's not a bad moment to wrap up on a sort of glass half full moment. I mean, I do reflect periodically, because obviously I spend my entire life thinking about, both our security and our economic prospects. And, if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether, a compelling economic industrial strategy for the UK would be based on rearming, essentially, I certainly, if I believed you, would have been pretty depressed. And it just shows you how far all of our sort of approaches, essentially, to this very chaotic and difficult world, how our attitudes have had to change. But you're right, I think it is important for us to see this investment, at least in part, as an opportunity, as well as in response to really quite, challenging and dangerous times.
These are difficult times. We've already, you and I are quite a pair, aren't we? We could depress the most uplifted of audience by talking about our economic situation and then global security, and we haven't even started on the state of society and community. But you're absolutely right. They're very difficult times for, as the government sort of says, working people up and down the country, and tough choices are going to have to be made. And I think we'll see a lot more of this in 10 days' time in the spending review from the Chancellor. My guess is because Rachel Reeves, as you would put it, looked at the lessons of the past, she will want to be very clear that this is a government that's making choices. So I expect she will focus on growth, defence and health, will be my guess. We can, in 10 days' time, we can come back and talk about whether I was right or not. But my guess is that's where she goes. Yep. So the really interesting questions to ask is, we understand that they probably match the nation's priorities right now, or sensible conversation in the nation. So let's have the honest conversation about what we're stopping. And this has been one of the hardest things. People always ask me, quite rightly, they say, hold on a minute. You used to be in charge of the civil service. It was supposed to shrink during your time. It just grew and grew and grew. And some of that's COVID, Brexit, Ukraine, all these sorts of things. One of the things that we're very bad at as voters as well is giving our governments permission to stop things. Yeah. On an annual basis, you always, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor or somebody will send a minute round Whitehall saying, we've got to stop a whole load of things. Please raid the cupboards and come back with your so-called stop list. What are the things that we should... And if you're lucky, the Chancellor or the Chief Secretary to the Treasury will get one or two things back on the list, which, at most save you a few million quid, and everybody's arguing that everything else in government is absolutely essential. I would say when it comes to government spending and these difficult times, is when you get one of the most peculiar, irregular verbs in Whitehall, which is, my spending is essential, your spending should be reviewed, and his spending should be cut. It's sort of the Whitehall mentality when times are tough. Because nobody's really very good at coming forward and saying, I've got the things that we should stop.
Well, look, we've got the spending review in a couple of weeks. Come back again and let's have a long conversation about all of that. This is, I think, the moment, though, when we'll call to a close this absolutely fascinating conversation. Simon Case, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely gripping. Thank you. And I just want to remind those watching and listening that an edition of Talking Politics USA will drop into your podcast feeds on Tuesday. I'll be back with Paul for Talking Politics. We don't call it Talking Politics UK, but the more domestic focused Talking Politics on Wednesday. And as I say, fascinating tour d'horizon with Simon Case. Thank you again. Hope you'll come back soon, Simon, and thank you all for tuning in.